Hi, I'm Ezra Ross, and today I'm going to touch upon some issues regarding barriers to reentry. The reentry process into society as a returning citizen has many barriers that clients struggle to deal with. These barriers, along with not having their criminogenic needs treated, are the key drivers in the resistantly high recidivism rates we see in America, which is a core corrections focus. The barriers aren't the same for everybody. Some of them are based on what your background is, such as a race, class, and family stability. These can be a large influence on the barriers that you face and your ability to overcome barriers. The barriers go from as small as just having clothing on your back, food, and a state ID to broad things like stigma against felons, structural racism, and other aspects of the economic system. It's almost better to imagine barriers not as like a wall, but as sort of like a hurdle. Like you're in the track jumping hurdles, and you can jump over some issues in your path, but it's very hard to do it consistently. Jump over every single hurdle, just like it's very hard to go completely straight, especially without proper support and training, because the amount of barriers or hurdles can be so intimidating. The barriers come from things like community stigma, from governmental policies, from landlords, from employers, and from the correction system itself, unfortunately. But only some of this can actually be solved with the correction system based on what they have control over. The first free steps returning citizens take have them bobbing and weaving and dancing through barriers already. Immediately, they face barriers based on transportation. Some of them have struggle access getting transportation or getting to public transportation. Many others will be taken on these buses from corrections and kind of dropped in the middle of a city. Oftentimes, when they're dropped in the middle of a city, it'll be late at night when they can't access services, and the only people really about are drug dealers on the street next to them, and the liquor stores open. Only all the only things they have are really opportunities for intoxication. Along with this, when they arrive, they often just have the clothing on their back. Usually, don't have food, and many of them, about half at some points, don't even have a state government ID. These are some of the hardest immediate barriers that they face in the immediate days. Just having food, having an ID so they can access social services, so they can start looking for a job, so they can find housing. Because you can't really do any of those things without an ID. These types of barriers, the most immediate barriers, tended to fade within the first month. Outside of transport remained a consistent issue, but the idea was at the utmost importance. Having that at the beginning, because not having that could delay you getting to some of those more intermediate stability needs, such as finding housing, finding a job, and the longer you delay on getting that immediate need, the more likely you are to just end up falling back into crime. All this certainly leads to or exacerbates the issues of why so many people end up reoffending and recidivizing during that first immediate period, those first few days. First month is a big window, but even the first few days, the first few hours, it kind of like diminishes each time. It starts really high at the beginning. Certainly, the barriers are difficult throughout the first month, but they really are just lined up at the beginning. Stability needs such as housing and a meaningful job are often cited by clients as the most important things that they focus on, usually after these other basic needs are met. Housing was a very common thing that people struggled with, either because of not allowing people because of their felons or just not wanting to rent to them. Anywhere that would end up being remotely desirable or pro-social for them to kind of desist and stay away from drugs would also not be affordable or not want to rent to them. The only places that would be affordable and wanting to rent to folks like this would unfortunately be areas where they would be closer and more susceptible to drug use. Considering these things, it governs so much of our society, where we live, who we associate with, the social patterns of everything we do. Race serving as a barrier to reentry just does kind of intuitively make sense. It shouldn't be really much of a shocking phenomenon, and class follows with it because in our society, uh, race and class are very much intertwined. Despite there being no real statistical significant difference when you look at self-reported studies of criminal behavior based between races, there's no real difference in race between criminal behavior. African Americans are jailed and arrested at over 4 times the rate of white Americans. These kinds of patterns will lead to the cultural assumption that crime itself is a racial phenomenon, rather than the criminal justice system is a racial phenomenon. And this kind of builds onto the point where crime is seen as racial, and vice versa, people of certain races are seen as inherently criminal. This was shown through audit studies by Deva Pager, which showed the implicit assumed criminality of African Americans when applying to jobs where African American applicants would have the same callback rates. African Americans without a record would have the same callback rates as white Americans with a record, because they kind of assumed that if they all had a record, and the ones that didn't have it on there were just lying about it. Your class in society also affects your chances of getting more minor charges dropped, or being able to be outside of prison and fight your case outside of there. And it leads to higher success within the courts, which leads you, and being poor leads to you languishing in jail, not being able to make money. And this is also how these patterns within the criminal justice system get socially reproduced. The debt you have, especially things like restitution debt and child support debt, accrued during prison. And then when you get out, after, let's say you've been there a year or two, these built up debts that you now have to start immediately paying back without really any forgiveness or leeway end up serving as barriers too. Around half of corrections clients have open cases within the child support system. These clients were already poor. Vast majority of people who enter prison still are significantly close to poverty, and among these, many of them who were poor and entering also had debts with their child support before they entered prison. And the enforcement mechanisms for debt when they get out, the fact that you can't reduce the payments and wage garnishment, they'll garnish your property, put liens on things. It really discourages people from even just getting a job, because you're the only things that are available to a lot of these people, especially when they first get out, are very menial, low-wage work. And it's hard enough for many of these people to support themselves on a close to or at minimum wage salary in most areas, but then you add in the amount child support takes in, it starts to not make sense to people, and the incentives structures are going to cause them to not want to get a job and just go back to criminal activity to make money. Essentially, the stiff nature of these penalties, which also can include asset forfeiture, drives them into the arms of crime. Not just that, but it drives them out of the arms of their family. And most of these people, when talked to in studies or in interviews, point to family and stable family and family being there for them as a significant help when they're trying to go through the reentry process and reintegrate into society, because it's a vital support system. While reforming corrections and better policies upon release can help with some things and some barriers, even past the release, it's still a minefield of stigma, of legal deprivation of rights, of discrimination through work and housing. So it's still extremely hard to even go crooked, let alone just going completely straight. With the layers of institutional biases and policies and stigmas that hurt returning citizens combined with the high recidivism rates, it almost starts to seem as if the system is recycling just the same people over and over again, kind of putting them in this vicious circle till they age out, almost as if it was kind of intentional, but it's either way, it's not. It's very cruel. Um, but even so, corrections can still play a big part in the role of reentry because of that early period, that those first few days where many people either drop out or start anew. A lot of the barriers that they'll face, such as not having an ID, are things that can be solved by corrections, and some departments are working more towards solving these issues. This lack of ID makes it so you can't get into buildings to access services, um, and really is a barrier to start your footing again. If corrections to start with making sure everyone exits with an ID along with their exit strategy, their plans, along with a little bit of food, a little bit of money, that can go an incredible way to just reducing the recidivism in those first few days. Along with that, corrections can drop people off on these buses at more convenient times to access services rather than dropping them off at the middle of the night, where even if they had IDs, they're still going to be very susceptible. But with no ID and nowhere to turn, they're basically left on their own in many cases. There are clearly very, very many barriers to reentry, but there's also many opportunities. Each person is still an opportunity to change someone's life and succeed in the world. Not everyone who's reentering, though, is ready and prepared for that change, but even those who are really struggle to make that change with the way the correction system and society outside of that is setting them up for success. The philosophy that's been dominant for so years within corrections of the punitive model also hurts because if you're not really thinking about and caring about rehabilitation when they're inside, you're not really going to maximize their ability to change and get better. The moves towards more integrated and collaborative approaches between community organizations and corrections is a great step and going in the right direction because without that smooth transition between them, clients can really easily fall through the cracks. When they're just dropped off at them sitting in the middle of the night without a photo ID, they're a prime target for just dropping back out. A lot of these issues can be fixed with corrections, and we can work to ensure everyone is as prepared as they are. However, there's still many barriers that they're going to face in employment and housing discrimination, and that's something that needs to be solved on the political level. As my presentation, are there any questions, comments, thoughts? Thank you for your time.